two questions. One is the question of democracy. How does our debt really sort of handicap the range of options that we have democratically speaking? But I also wanted to speak about something you wrote very recently about on the Tricontinental, which is corruption. How corruption is this red herring? Like if you walk around Kenya today, we have now 15 or 20 potential presidential candidates, and all of them are saying we're going to be anti-corruption.
Yeah. The question of China, I think Jason has done a fantastic job of nuancing it. I think a lot of what's lost in the analysis or the commentary that comes from the North or the West is this absence of nuance. Like most things in the world, things are complicated. And I think he's done a very good job, Jason, of just complicating the China story vis-a-vis Africa. It's a complicated story.
African countries are drowning in debt. From Zambia to South Africa, Ghana to Kenya. Our schools are shutting down, our hospitals are dilapidated, our infrastructure barely works because we have to make interest payments on debt that seems interminable. Now, in recent years, our young people have been going to the streets saying that they are unemployed, they are hungry, they are angry, asking their leaders, where is our future? And every time they're told, just wait, we first have to pay our debt. But the thing is that African countries have been paying their debt. In fact, before the pandemic, African countries were paying 3.5 times more in debt repayments than they would pay for health, education, and social welfare combined. 3.5 times. Think about that. And the thing is that this debt problem is not new. We have had it since the colonial era. And the colonial masters took out debt to pay for infrastructure that they used to extract our raw materials, to steal from our people. And then when we negotiated independence, we had to take out debt to buy back the very land that they stole from us. And then when the debtors came calling in the 1980s, they sent us the World Bank and the IMF, who came with policies that absolutely decimated even the little infant industries that we had. And they shoved us into a cycle of poverty that has made us dependent on debt interminably. Now, Thomas Sankara, who is a founding father of the continent and who this podcast owes its name, he could see this clearly. And what he called it was a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa intended to subjugate our growth and development. So even though they dress it up in fancy language, they call it economics, they call it finance, ultimately what it is the new colonialism. It is theft, because there's a grandmother somewhere in Malawi today who is going to walk into a clinic and she's not going to get the insulin that she needs because the money has been used to pay debt to some fat cat hedge fund manager in New York. There is a child in Ghana who is going to breathe their last because they didn't get the antibiotics they need because that money has gone to some banker in Zurich. And the thing is, when you listen to our pundits, when you listen to our economists, they talk as though this debt that we have must be paid back. It is our moral obligation to pay this debt back. But if this debt was intended to break us and not to make us, is it really moral for us to pay it back? Sankara in 1987 at a meeting of the Organization for the African Union said, we cannot repay the debt because we are not responsible for this debt. We cannot repay the debt because we have nothing to pay it with. We cannot repay the debt because the others owe us what the greatest wealth could never repay, the debt of blood. And just 4 months later, he was assassinated. His words ring truer today than they did then because this cycle continues. On today's episode, which we dedicate especially to the memory of Thomas Sankara, we ask ourselves, how did we get here? And more importantly, how the hell do we get ourselves out of this situation? We are joined from Dubai by Grieve Chelwa, who is the chair of the Social Sciences Department at the Africa Institute, and who was recently appointed as a member of the Papal Commission on Debt and Development Crisis in the Global South. And from Nairobi, we are joined by Jason Braganza, who is the Executive Director of African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Welcome to our show, and thank you for being with us today. And I will start with you, Jason. Just give us a very short overview of where we are vis-a-vis debt on the continent. Who do we owe? How much do we owe? Which countries are teetering on the brink of collapse?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the show. It's an absolute pleasure. And as you say, being very close to a PayPal appointee is extremely even more honorable to be here. So I think, look, the situation in Africa on debt is very dire. According to the IMF, we've got over close to half the continent, 31 or 32 countries that are in a problem of debt distress or high risk of debt distress. And so, what we do need to keep in mind is that a big part of the continent is facing a severe debt crisis. The second issue here is to remember how the debt situation is being analyzed or being assessed. To a very large extent, those who believe in the status quo on analyzing debt seem to think that it's just a cash flow issue. But as you mentioned in your introduction, this is more than just countries not having enough cash. It's a structural matter of how our economies are set up, how the global economic system is set up to extract and give very little back. We've had four countries that have defaulted since the COVID 19 pandemic. This is Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Chad. And we've got countries like Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, Senegal, Rwanda, who are all facing different types of debt challenges, and have had to either restructure, reorient, or reschedule their debt commitments and their debt burdens. And out of the countries that I've mentioned already, many of them are spending more on debt service interest repayments than there are on public services like education and health. So the situation is fairly dire. And I think the quote that you also mentioned of Comrade Thomas Sankara is actually apt, because we are paying this debt not in terms of dollars, but in terms of human African lives. It's extremely, extremely important for us to put that at the center of the conversation that we're having today. So that's sort of the picture that we're painting, that we can paint right now. I'm sorry, it's very bleak on a very warm and bright Sunday here in Nairobi, but it is bleak reading. But hopefully the papal appointee can give us some visions that he may have seen from the Vatican.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Yes, please. And we go right to our papal appointee, Grieve. Welcome to the show, and walk us through the history of this debt. Because when the debt is discussed, and like for example, during the protest that Kenya had last year, where people who went to the streets kept being told, these austerity measures are required because we have debt and we must repay our debt. It was always framed as though this debt is some sort of reason, some sort of like like Jason has said, a cash flow issue. This is just a thing that we must do because it's something that we committed to. But this has historical roots, very deep historical roots. Do you want to walk us through that?
By the way, thank you so much, Mamka, for your podcast. Congratulations on it. I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I very much like the name of it, in memory of somebody who's very dear to all of us, somebody who dared to be different, who so it's really, really, really remarkable, and also nice to be with my good comrade and brother Jason. Thank you for the congratulations on this. Lightning struck. One of us got on this commission, so I have a big, huge responsibility to be able to bring to this commission to bear the demands from people from our part of the continent. And I think it's also very important that the Catholic Church and His Holiness the Pope is taking on this issue, because at the end of the day, it is not a financial, economic issue. It is a moral issue. It is an issue of justice. And aspects of the injustice are contained in how you quoted Thomas Sankara at the beginning there, Mamka, and in the comments that Jason just made. He correctly diagnosed the problem as not a cash flow problem, but as a structural problem. It is something to do with the way Africa is structured, has been incorporated into the global economic system, or what some of our comrades call the global capitalist system, that generates these types of crises every so often, right? And I think when you ask the question, Mamka, about the history of the debt, this is not a 2020 thing or 2018 thing. It is something that's been recurring ever since the 1960s, right? So, these debt cycles keep coming and going. So there's something structural that keeps generating these particular types of crisis. And there's something about the debt that is useful in keeping Africa perpetually subjugated. So it plays a role in perpetually subjugating the continent. And that's why it keeps happening in this way. So, I mean, that's just a scenario about history. So it's a historical thing, it's a historical force. And if we don't do anything to solve the issues at the structural level, at the level of justice, at the level of morality, reorient our economies in such a way that Africa is not perpetually on the receiving end. We reorient our economies in a much more justice-oriented way, then these problems will keep recurring, right? So I think that's sort of the point that I wanted to illustrate here. And the recent iteration of the debt, as the audience may be very aware, many African countries had their debts forgiven, which is a terrible word because it should be, the actual word is cancelled because it's unjust, right? So a lot of the debt was cancelled in the early 2000s as part of this highly indebted poor countries initiative, right? So we had, for example, Zambia's debt was cancelled from $7 billion pre-2005 to like $1 billion or just under $1 billion 2005. But then again, we find ourselves in a situation where Zambia, all of a sudden, a couple of years down the line, owes a huge chunk of money, which is the sort of the typical story that you'll get if you go around. All those countries that had their debts cancelled, their unjust debts cancelled, are back again, right? Again, to the point, Jason's point about this being not a cash flow issue, but a structural issue, right? So I think this is a useful concept and useful frame of looking at the problem, not so much as a thing that we caused, again, not something that we cause ourselves, but that's something that we can't, that will keep happening in spite of our best attempts as Africans. Even if we had Jason Braganza as Minister of Finance in Kenya, but if we don't change the structure of how the global economy works vis-a-vis Kenya, vis-a-vis Africa, even Jason may end up in a situation where he bequeaths to the next generation a debt problem. So anyways, that's something.
Great. Thank you so much, Grieve. I think let's stay with that point of this sort of inevitability of debt, this structural baking in of debt that is happening to Africa. There's a cycle. There's a way that it goes, So walk us through, how does it go? Where does it begin? And how do we find ourselves stuck in this cycle, unable to ever exit?
Okay, so I'll be very brief, and I know my brother Jason might have things to say about this. So first of all, we have to understand the role that debt plays in general. So there's sort of, is it bad to borrow? In principle, no, it's not bad to borrow. It's how you borrow, what kind of, how you borrow at what rates of interest over what time horizons, and your plans for paying it back, right? So essentially, the problem we have in the African situation is a problem of underdevelopment, right? Our people are eager to develop. We want to develop our continent. And part of the reason why we're underdeveloped is because of history, because of colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism, and so on and so forth, right? So we're in a hurry to develop. For example, when I look at the Zambian case, right? If you were head of state in Zambia in the 2000s, you had just inherited an economy that had just come out of structural adjustment. And structural adjustment was an outcome of an earlier debt crisis, as you sort of rightfully illustrated. If you had been head of state in Zambia in the early 2000s, right after structural adjustment, you would have inherited a country that was underdeveloped. You'd have inherited a country that had a huge infrastructural backlog. Now, why this huge infrastructure backlog? Primarily because of structural adjustment. Because in the structural adjustment years, we were told to just spend the amount of money that we raise from taxes. Sometimes called run a cash budget. So you spend with the cash that's on hand. Now, with that kind of running your fiscal affairs in that way, you can build roads, you can build hospitals, because these are huge expenditure outlays. So we had a situation where our leaders at the time in the early 2000s, then we're like, okay, if we have to develop, we've got to lay out the highways, we've got to put up the power stations, we've got to put up the schools, the universities, the hospitals, all these things that are important preconditions for development, are useful for development. But then, how do we do it? Domestically, we have a problem with domestic resource mobilization. Again, it's a structural thing. we have a difficulty in collecting resources domestically because the transnational corporations, the multinational corporations are always spiriting this money away, right? So where do I look to? Let me look at sort of in terms of raising money internationally. I look around internationally, where can this money come from? The World Bank, which ostensibly was set up to provide this type of financing on a long-term basis, doesn't do it anymore, right? So where do? I can look towards China to get some aspects of that financing, or I can look toward, or I can look towards private hedge funds, the private capital markets, and those kind of things. But the private capital markets, A, are going to give you expensive money. B, they also won't give it to you over a long enough time horizon, right? So these are the kind of, so we have to understand the source of the debt, in my estimation, is ostensibly good reasons. There's a desperate yearning for development, but there are no finances to finance that development. So what do? Then you resort to these kinds of scenarios where you're then looking for expensive money, which gets you into a debt trap. Right. And so I know I've spent so much time talking about this, and I throw it back to you, but that's essentially how I see it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Grieve. Now let's come back to you, Jason. Tell us, who exactly do we owe on the continent?
So the debt composition on the continent is quite diverse. It has changed over the last 20, 30 years. Whereas we did have what some may consider traditional lenders. So, many of your European countries, the Americas, and so on. But over the last 15 to 20 years, that has changed quite dramatically. We've seen a diversification of the bilateral lenders, mostly including the coming onto the continent of China, India, Russia. These are, and even the countries from the Middle East, where Grieve is joining us. These have become significant actors in the credit market on the continent. Secondly, the commercial dimension of our debt has also changed very dramatically. Whereas the components were quite small, very little component from international capital markets. This has now exploded, and it is now actually dwarfing some of the debt that is being held by bilateral lenders and even multilateral lenders. The fourth component is the multilateral lenders. So these are like your World Bank, your IMFs, the African Development Bank. Even these lenders have diversified. We now have the export-import banks that provide credit lines for largely energy and infrastructure projects. We've got development financial institutions from outside the continent that have, entered the debt market and credit market and produced instruments for the continent. So these are the kind of how the debt or the creditor architecture looks like. The largest, of course, bilateral lender still looks, I think, is China now on the continent, and in terms of whom we owe, and of course that also has a soft power play, to what Greaves was talking about in terms of how the system then continues to perpetuate some of those inequalities. But I did want to build on one very important point that Grieve mentioned around the structural nature of why we find ourselves in these debt traps and the movement away from how we measure the economic performance of a country. I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of countries in Africa as well were encouraged to do what we call a gross domestic product rebasing of their economies. This just means recalculating, what constitutes all the income that the country generates in a particular financial period. And that rebasing found that many countries were actually transitioning from what was considered generally low income countries to low middle income countries. And that was also a structural contribution to the type of finance that many African countries could access. So they were now unable. So a country like Kenya that has rebased its economy back in 2013, 2014, all of a sudden could not qualify for certain zero interest concessional financing and had to now start looking elsewhere. But at the same time, its trading conditions with countries in the European Union, in North America, also changed because they were considered to be a slightly bigger economy. But in real terms, that was not the case. All they did was update their accounting methods of what is made in the economy. And I think that's a very important dimension also of whether we are using the correct tools to measure our economies. Our economies are largely still informal, subsistence, low value. So the methods for calculating gross domestic products, are these the correct ones? that we're using to understand the true value of what is being generated. And sort of a dovetail to that is the alignment of debt instruments to development projects. Grieve mentioned, countries going to international markets for finance. These are largely expensive but short-term instruments that are largely or mostly invested in long-term development projects. So by the time the return yield on these investments come good, the debt service repayment is already due. So there's also that misalignment between the debt instrument from capital markets, international capital markets, and the development projects that are being funded by these types of instruments. And so that's a perpetuating structural issue towards the debt trap that Grieve has mentioned. Thanks.
Great. So beyond just the amount of money we're borrowing or the reason we're borrowing it for, one of the things that, in fact, Kenya's president, Ruto, has talked about a lot is credit rating. But credit rating is only important insofar as it determines interest rates. Now, you've talked about, the concessional debt that a lot of countries that used to be low income, such as Kenya, cannot access anymore. And now we are going to, maybe bilaterals who are a bit more affordable in terms of interest rate. But then you also have the private capital markets, such as the Eurobond, which are very expensive. But what I find consistent across all these, and I just don't know that maybe I haven't come across a lot of literature that discusses this, is that if we say we are actually a capitalist economy, it means that any sort of investment that anybody makes, whether they're making a financial investment such as debt or anything else, they should be able to bear the risk. There cannot be an investment made in the world of capital that is completely de-risked. But a lot of the debt that is taken up by governments is completely de-risked. The idea is that if Africans have to die from lack of water, lack of education, that interest must be paid. So how is that an investment? How is that a capitalist investment if it is completely de-risked at using the lives of human beings? Grieve, do you want to comment on this one?
I think in a sense, so really the moral and ethical aspects to debt, and most folks don't realize that there's a certain underlying morality when people begin to have a conversation about debt, right? And often when people invoke the argument, you've got to pay. You borrowed, therefore you've got to pay. They're invoking some ethics, right? Terrible ones, but they're making an ethical, moral argument about the responsibility of the borrower to pay no matter what. And it's very strange that this one-way morality is at its most sort of salient when it comes to Africa. For some reason, folks think, because again, the morality is influenced by a certain conception of how Africa works. So Africans do this to themselves. Africans are incompetent, right? The reason why they can't pay back is because they're just incompetent. Therefore, they've got to pay. It is their fault after all, right? And I think the argument that Jason and I are trying to make in this discussion is that actually Africa is at the receiving end of an unjust world structural economy, right? Even if we had the best people in these offices, if we don't change the structure of the economy, we'll still have these debt cycles. So the point is, yes, and you're very right. There's a very weird morality that only applies to Africa. And even I remember once when Zambia defaulted, and I was talking to one of these hedge fund people sought me out, thinking that they could make an argument to me that would, I don't know what they were thinking, but they was making the argument to say, the Zambian government has defaulted, blah, blah, they need to pay us back. They have to pay us back. And I said, it takes two to tango. You took a bet on Zambia. That's how capitalism works. Capitalism is taking a bet. You took a bet on Zambia. Your bet didn't work out. So you've got to take a hit. Zambia also took a bet by borrowing money from you, right? So both of you, two parties, made a wrong bet. So you both have to bear the consequences equally. That is be the right, and that's my sense of morality, is the argument I made to this guy, but completely he didn't buy it. But I think it's a very important point you're making. And for example, one of the very interesting ideas that's been floated around that tries to address this, and I'd be curious to hear what Jason may think of this, is this idea of GDP indexed bonds. right? So a country should issue bonds that are linked to the performance of its economy. If its economy goes into recession, then interest payments are adjusted downwards likewise, so that the creditors and the borrowers both share equally in the potential of downside risk, or at least a bond that's linked to the performance of copper or cocoa or whatever the issue may be. But you're right. I mean, it's very interesting, strange type of capitalism that's only applicable to Africa with a very strange type of morality attached to it. So I think that's a very fantastic point that you raised.
Yeah, yes. So before, because I want us to talk about like the downstream
Yeah.
effects of this debt, because they have downstream effects not just on the fact that our economies continue to remain underdeveloped, but it also means that we don't really have democracies. Because as long as we have to pay the piper, there's someone who calls the shots. But before we come to that, I want to talk about China, because China, when we talk about debt in Africa, is always the elephant in the room. Not really an elephant in the room. Any economics class you take in the global north is going to be talking about China and trapping Africa in debt. And how true is this, Jason? How much does China actually colonize Africa using debt?
I mean, the more things change, the more they remain the same, right? And I think this is the geopolitics that comes with the global financial system. And I think North America and Europe sleeping at the wheels and all of a sudden waking up and seeing that there's a new superpower that is deciding and being very influential on the continent. So I think we need to be very cautious about the narrative around China. And I've said this on several occasions. There's nothing in totality that is different from what Europeans and North Americans have done on the continent for several decades. Soft power, military instability, military positions, and then using ODA as and development cooperation as the tool to finance some of that, and gradually also further contributing to the extractive economy model that they have. I think the most tangible difference that you would say with China is that it pays little credence to the internal issues of a country. I think that is one of its models of operation. And there's an organization called Development Reimagined that has done some really fantastic work in analyzing the role of China in Africa, both from a political perspective, but also from a geopolitical and financing point of view. During COVID-19, China was the largest creditor that gave debt relief to the continent, combined in terms of what the G7 has given. In terms of debt restructuring, it's one of the only bilateral creditors that does domestic debt restructuring relative to the G7. And by domestic debt restructuring, what I mean is they are willing to sit down in a country and use national and domestic laws to figure out how to do debt restructurings. Very few creditors do that. China is one of them, right? In terms of the tangible arrangements that has been, from the debt and the investments that China has made, they're very tangible. It's questionable in terms of the methods that they use, but our leaders will turn around and say, "But here is the road, or here is the port." Or here's the hospital. For over 60 years of global North, Western European, and North American investments, there's very little to show from that, despite the conditions around governance, human rights, and so on. So I think we need to be very careful around the narrative when we're talking about China, and not be very quick to jump on this global Northwestern European narrative, and pay a lot more attention to the statistics and the data and the facts that are out there. I think John Hopkins has got a very good public database on debt servicing and debt arrangements between China and Africa, and you'll see actually the arrangements are pretty okay and decent when you compare it, with other bilateral lenders to the continent. So I think we should be careful, and this is not me putting China off the hook. They've got a lot to answer for: labor rights, human rights, contributing to corruption and poor governance. They have a lot to answer for. But as Grieve correctly pointed out, it is a risk and a gamble that both parties take. And I think when you're going to gamble with your public, purses, you need to be very much ready for what comes with the consequences. And I think on both sides that's what is happening. Yeah. But I'm curious to also hear what Greaves thinks about China, because he's spoken a lot and written a lot about China as well in Africa.
Yes, Grieve, I want you to talk about China, but I also want you to now touch on two questions. One is the question of democracy. How does our debt really sort of like handicap the range of options that we have democratically speaking? But I also want you to speak about something you wrote very recently about on the Tricontinental, which is corruption. How corruption is this red herring? Like if you walk around Kenya today, we have now 15 or 20 potential presidential candidates, and all of them are saying we're going to be anti-corruption, as though corruption is the problem. It is a red herring, but Grieve, please.
Yeah, the question of on the question of China, I think Jason has done a fantastic job of nuancing it. I think a lot of what's lost in the analysis or the commentary that comes from the North or the West is this absence of nuance. Like most things in the world, things are complicated. And I think he's done a very good job, Jason, of just complicating the China story vis-a-vis Africa. It's a complicated story. One can't just talk about it in black and white. One has to add some gray to it, which is what he has done in a very good way. On the question of democracy and debt, and I think this is a point about what debt does for us is cripple us in terms of autonomy. I mean, one of the things, for example, when our forefathers and mothers were trying to fight or negotiate for independence was the issue of self-determination, which is the point, to be able to run our lives as we see fit in the economy sphere, in the political sphere, in all other spheres of our existence. And one thing that debt has done for us in Africa is to cripple autonomy, particularly in the economic sphere, right? This inability to be able to design for yourself what you see as a right program for economic development. We're not short of ideas. I mean, go to any Ministry of Planning, any Ministry of Finance, go to continental bodies, you'll find really grand, sensible plans for development. I always like to read the Lagos Plan of Action from 1980, right? Read that document. It's pretty coherent and straightforward and sensible. But we could not implement that plan of action because of structural adjustment, which came because of debt, right? The debt problem. So this is what debt for us. It really limits our autonomy in the policy sphere. We're not short of smart people. There are so many Jasons and Mamkas littered across our beautiful continent, but they cannot bring their expertise to bear because primarily our policy making when we have debt is always outsourced to either Washington, New York, or London. That's the problem we have, right? That's what debt does for us. This is the real major tragedy beyond the real issues of health that you articulated. But this idea of just loss of policy autonomy is quite devastating. I always like very quickly. Yes, you want to react to this?
Yes, I want to react to that, because before you jump into talking about corruption, I want you to plumb just a little bit deeper, because we cannot leave without talking about the World Bank and the IMF, the international financial institutions, and how they sort of set up this entire regime of debt, this never-ending debt. And the Trump administration is now talking about, commissioning some of these instruments, and I do wonder whether they would actually do it. But we have to talk about the fact that they have been the institutions that have basically, structured this, never-ending debt.
Mm-hmm. You're right. I mean, by the way, I was in a discussion recently with some colleagues in the US, American economists in the US, who think the Trump administration is going to defund or at least decommission the IMF and the World Bank. Especially the IMF. I think to myself, this is the best return the US can ever have. I mean, the IMF is such an effective tool of furthering American interests. It works. For very little money. It actually does work. I mean, the US in the IMF has 16% of the voting share. And to be able, most things that are of fundamental importance in the IMF, for them to be adopted, right, they need a supermajority, which is 85% more of the shareholders of the IMF should vote for that thing, 85% or more. The US alone has 16% of the voting share. So the US has effective veto power in the IMF. Not even the US Security Council does it work so nicely for them. But in the IMF, it does work. I'm sure the people briefing Trump will tell him, this one works. Mr. President, this one works precisely for furthering our own interests. So the IMF works.
So tell us what
What,
those interests are, Grieve. What are these
sorry?
interests? What are these
I
US
mean,
interests?
essentially making sure that places like Africa are perpetually subjugated so that, they're always easy to manipulate by the US. If you want something in the UN Security Council or UN General Assembly, or you want some, they always line up behind you. B, they'll always be able to supply you perpetually cheap labor and cheap goods to power your industrial machine in the north. I mean, they'll always be there at your beck and call. They can supply very poor Kenyan men and women to Haiti at a moment's notice. Things like this, So things like this, it does work. So those are that's the role. That's what the IMF is. Its job is to maintain the global economic order for the furtherance of the US and its satellite states in Western Europe. And it does that job wonderfully, is the point I'm making. I've talked too much, so I can leave
No,
the
Grieve, I
corruption
know you
question.
have to leave shortly, and I'm hoping that Jason will have some more time. So I want you to talk a bit about debt and corruption. And then when you leave us, Jason and I are going to talk about the solutions, because we have to think about ways in which we can break away from this debt forever.
I'm so humbled that Jason is going to the hard part, because this is the part I can't do. I'm very good at throwing stones, but the solutions is one that I'm terrible at. So I'm very, very happy that my good brother, you're in very good hands, on that side. I mean, you're right. Corruption the corruption narrative has been weaponized very, very effectively, again, by the IMF and World Bank when they started this whole good governance crusade of theirs in the 1990s. The problem of Africa is a problem of good governance, which is a problem of corruption. If Africa can sort out its corruption, Africa will develop, right? It's a red herring because, yes, corruption is a problem. And by the way, when they come to look at corruption, when they define corruption, they're mostly looking at it as a domestic phenomenon, not as a transnational phenomenon, as a phenomenon of, bribing some police officers, as a phenomenon of some of our political elites being corrupt, being bribable. But they never look at issues to do with the corruption that comes from transnational corporations. The fact that transnational corporations can spirit away from Africa on an annual basis, somewhere between $50 billion and $300 billion, whatever that number is. I think the UNECA had a fascinating report in 2015, a landmark report on illicit financial flows. That is corruption. And according to that report, that level of corruption constitutes 80% in their calculation of corruption, totally thought about. But essentially, what we focus on, what is focused on when it comes to Africa, is the 5 or 10%, which is mostly bribery, and we think of that as the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is actually the fact that transnational corporations are stealing all this money from Africa every day, every year, and they've been doing it for so long, and that number is in the trillions. How tragic that is. So corruption is the corruption narrative. And this is why a lot of global North actors love to fund subsidizing that narrative, love to make that narrative concrete. They love to make that narrative, put it into our curriculum, put it into our syllabi, talk about it on TV and radio. And therefore, people begin to believe that the problem is ours. Again, this is what you have to do. You've got to convince Africans that the reasons why they are poor is solely their fault. They're corrupt, they're lazy, they're all these kinds of things. So it really fits into that trope of blaming putting the blame at the feet of the Africans. So yes, corruption is a red herring. It is a problem, but not as significant a problem as it is made out to be, especially when one comes to think about the causes of underdevelopment. Africa is underdeveloped not because somebody bribed a police officer, not because some minister got a kickback here and there. Those things, make the situation worse. But the fundamental causes of Africa's state of underdevelopment are really external forces, whether be it overt sort of like military intervention or covert type of neo-colonial type of things, whether it be the actions of transnational corporations, whether it be the actions of the IMF, World Bank, and other allied institutions. That, in my estimation, is where the problem is. Right? That's where the problem is. And that's why it is so difficult to fix those things, because those things are doing the job they were set up to do.
So this is on the question of corruption. One of the most impactful corruption scandals that a lot of African countries are going through right now is actually the Eurobond. And the Eurobond came about because of this sense that, aid is ineffective, aid does not lead to development, but if you give debt, however, and we're going to have a subsequent episode where we talk about this at the micro level, where we talk about individuals and debt and how that there's an entire industry in global development around that. But the idea of the Eurobond is that if you give debt instead, then there can't be corruption around debt, because the government is going to feel, obligated to pay it. And so they're going to live up to its expectations. But a country like Kenya, for example, cannot even account for the Eurobond that was secured in 2013, was it? It didn't even land in the country yet. The owners of that, the people who bought the Eurobond, who are in, London and New York, are going to get paid anyway. So that is theft, So talk about the Eurobond just a little bit.
Yeah, that is certainly theft. And I think the point I should have made a little bit more strongly before this is that transnational corporations cannot spirit away this money on their own. They must be working with some of our elites to do it. So some of the elites are collaborators. They're collaborators in this process of spiriting this money away. So again, the Eurobond story just fits into that mold. We've got transnational finance corporations, that are sort of lending us this money, but this money actually never shows up sometimes. There's a very fascinating book by Leonce Dikumana and James Boyce called Odious Debt. I don't know if you've read it. It's a fascinating book to read. And it really looks at this phenomenon has actually been happening ever since. So the concept of odious debt really is, I think, is a moral concept which says, we didn't borrow, therefore we have a moral obligation not to pay. So odious debt is debt borrowed in my name, but I did not benefit from it. So this used to happen a lot with lending from US banks to African countries in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s. The money would move from, for example, one account at the US bank, and it's been lent to Congo, but it has moved to another account in the same bank in New York. It never left. And yet on the Congo's books, it appears Congo owes that bank some money. And then Congo begins to pay interest rates on money that never even arrived, right? And the bounty is split between the US bankers and the Congolese elites, right? So something similarly, but again, this is corruption. This is the corruption we should be trying to focus on, the transnational type of corruption. That is the problem. So I'm not surprised that you have this issue with Eurobonds in Kenya. It's the same story with the tuna bonds in Mozambique. That story about Credit Suisse and in collaboration with Mozambican elites that led to a situation where the typical Mozambican was swindled and saddled with this debt that really never possibly arrived. Right. So again, this is, for me, when we talk about corruption, I hope that is what we are talking about. We're talking about the transnational nature of corruption with Western transnational multinational corporations, whether they be banks, whether they be mining conglomerates, so on and so forth, at the center, at the core of this mechanism of sucking all this money from Africa and bringing it to the north.
Great. So that actually, I know you have to go,